It is one of the original models of the Ghost in the Shell collaboration, one of Medarot S's first ever collabs with someone outside the franchise, but also was one of the first models to introduce the tune-up treatment to the game. It is KKS02 Oil Clay, REGRADED, with a kit of Stealth, Gatling, Napalm, multi-legs, and the leg ability of Adapter, which changes all terrain matches to A rank that are not already A rank or better. Now, essentially the event reward from the first time the event came around, Oil Clay is probably the model that all players that either joined in on the first run or the rerun have very likely collected and maybe stowed away because he didn't seem like much at that point. But a little closer look means that this model may focus mostly on collateral damage, but also is very good essentially as a nuke prepper more than a nuker himself. Stealth on the head part is a support-based skill that, once activated, will make him untouchable and untargetable essentially for his entire next turn, that unless he's already being targeted. In addition, this also means that he can bypass any active shields that are in play and attack exactly who he wants entirely unimpeded. Gatling on the right arm is a conventional shooting skill you could generally never ever go wrong with using, because as a scattered AoE, it will damage one part normally and then two others at random at 1/3 damage. It is also worth noting that scattered AoE attacks typically also have a higher base success stat, which means they're more likely to have hits land without being dodged or grazed, and also more likely to be landed as critical hits on top of that. Napalm is a gunpowder skill that is also a scattered AoE, meaning it'll have an explosive power as expected of a gunpowder such as missile or hyper missile, but as a scattered AoE it will damage one part normally and then two others at random at 1/3 damage, much like standard Gatling would. Multi-legs means that he will have relatively solid coverage across all terrains before any bonuses go live, as arguably multi-ped legs tend to be one of the next best all-rounded legs under biped in terms of terrain compatibility. But if you factor in the notion that he has Adapter as a leg ability, that honestly makes his legs probably one of the better, even as a free reward essentially when he was released, one of the better multi-ped legs you really couldn't ever go wrong with using. Because having A rank across the board means he has the solid multi-ped stats as you'd expect, but he has the terrain compatibility of a float leg, which makes him a little more user-friendly in many cases. Plus, it is also worth noting that Oil Clay is a gender N-type bot, which means you can fit his parts either on male or female tin pets freely and have the ultimate flexibility of how you choose to use him. In terms of armor, Oil Clay is more or less kind of in that mid-range where he's not bad, but also in that mid-range as mentioned where he's not bad but not terrible either, with a hit HP of about 3,700, arms about 2,750 each, and his legs at 3,600. Arms are going to be just a little bit squishy depending on how you use them, but between the head and legs, he has a relatively decent HP pool. His leg stats actually aren't too shabby either, at a mobility of 672, which is about the midpoint of where multi-peds tend to be, unless we've been spoiled with boss-type legs all through the game's history. An evade of 714 isn't too shabby, but also not great either, as it does mean he will have a relatively mediocre time, I guess you can call it, dodging or grazing attacks, but he has to rely on the fact that they're going to be even worse than his evade stat. A melee resist of 896 isn't terrible. It is just barely cusping 900 there, so it's kind of at that very bare minimum you'd want to be at in terms of keeping your damage low. And a shoot resist of 1036 isn't too shabby either. I'd have to say his legs are actually kind of mid-rounded in terms of the overall stats, as a leg you really can't ever go wrong with using, with moderately balanced performance across the board. In terms of his tune-up, Oil Clay kind of takes what he had, doesn't really add a whole lot to it, but focuses more on survivability and maybe some occasional power or speed buffs. In terms of his head, he has access to plus 30 to cool, plus 100 to heat, and gets one additional head use. Now, compared to most other stealth units that would get an extra turn that stealth is active, Oil Clay, on the other hand, kind of got the shorter end of the stick before that bonus actually went live, and just gets one additional use of being able to use it. So honestly, that plus the 100 to heat would be very good bonuses to capitalize on, to guarantee that he could get to the line moderately quickly to activate it and keep himself moderately untouchable. The right arm of Gatling has access to plus 200 to armor, plus 50 to success, and plus 50 to power. Now, being completely honest, that plus 50 may not be super noticeable at first glance, and being completely honest, as I look back on this, perhaps the armor might actually be a better upgrade to invest in, but that honestly kind of breaks down to how you choose to use Oil Clay. If you want to use him for survivability, go for the armor, but if you want to focus a little more on conventional shooting or combat tactics, you could go for the 50 in success and power and still see a relatively similar and equal performance. The left arm of Napalm has access to plus 200 to armor, plus 50 to cool, and plus 50 to power. So essentially kind of the same thing like the other arm, where you could go armor if you want to build him for survivability, or you could go for the power and cool and not really see any major change in his performance. Being completely honest, I am going to kind of go against my own norm here and say you could go for the armor as the better recommendation, primarily for the fact to help keep him alive longer. His legs have access to plus 200 to armor, plus 200 to melee resist, plus 100 to evade, and plus 50 to mobility. Now, being completely honest, Oil Clay's legs actually have a lot of very nice bonuses here that you really can't ever go wrong with using, regardless of which direction you take it. But, best recommended, I would definitely shoot for that plus 200 to armor and melee resist. The melee resist especially I would want to emphasize on, because even though his legs have relatively decent armor already, being able to bump his melee resist from almost 900 to about 1100 means he will have a very significant change in how he reduces damage from incoming melee types, which in turn will allow him to stay on the field longer. The plus 100 to evade and the plus 50 to mobility aren't bad bonuses, but compared to the armor and the melee resist, I would honestly emphasize going after those latter two first, because they offer so much better overall performance changes. Now, factoring in his original pure set and mixed parts scores, I did originally have him graded at a 5 out of 10 for his pure set and a 6 for his mixed, primarily for the fact that as a scattered AoE type fighter, he really didn't specialize too heavily in base damage overall, but instead was there kind of to help prep the foe for a nuker to come behind him and finish the job, and stealth only made this even more so easier for him. And having multi-legs with adapter meant you could use him pretty much anywhere and expect equal performance no matter what the terrain. Factoring in his bonuses with tune-ups, I would have to still maintain his pure set score at about a 5 out of 10, but I do definitely have to bump his mixed parts score up to a 7 out of 10. Given that even though Gatling and Napalm may have now extended use of versatility and viability as shield shredders, as they will now take down 3 charges of a shield instead of just 1 as before, stealth you may not see a lot of use on, to be completely honest, but his legs, just as they were then and still are now, are probably going to be the most valuable part on him, as a part that's not only friendly to both male and female type tin pets, unless a modifier prohibits you from using gender N type parts, but even then their stat spread is still well balanced enough that you really can't ever go wrong with using them.